boy, if there was one episode I was very hesitant to review, it was The Nightingale, especially with Mick Jagger as the Emperor of China, the whole whitewashing deal. I didn't want to touch that thing with a 10-foot pole. But with that being said, I found it to be very charming in its own way. Hear me out. The Nightingale stars legendary singer Mick Jagger, because obviously that would be the first choice for a Chinese emperor, right? And the emperor lives in a porcelain palace, completely cut off from the people of his country, until he hears rumors about a beautiful singing bird called the Nightingale. He demands for the bird to play a song for him in his palace. The kitchen maid, played by Barbara Hershey, takes him to the Nightingale. As the bird plays for the emperor is happy, and he becomes much more caring to his people. But when the emperor is given a mechanical version of the Nightingale, and the emperor is convinced by his court that the Nightingale was only flattering him, and he eventually banishes her from the palace. Eventually, the emperor falls ill and is very close to death, and only the healing power of the Nightingale can save him. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room. I definitely don't agree with the casting of Mick Jagger as the emperor, because clearly he's a British white guy. He's not an Asian American. He's not truly representing Chinese culture. But unfortunately, during the time when the episode was made, whitewashing wasn't negatively looked upon as it is nowadays. But even though he's really miscast in the role, you have to admit, Mick Jagger has a very interesting look for the emperor. I'm not saying it's the right look, but it's still an interesting one. And even watching how he presents himself through his body language and how he enters the room and how he sits, you can feel the power. He feels like a royal. And yeah, every now and then his acting is a bit wooden, but you could argue that as the emperor, he has to take himself very seriously, so you're not going to get a lot of big movements out of him. In this case, it kind of works. But again, why wasn't he played by an Asian actor like Pat Morita? Why wasn't he the emperor? That would have been cool seeing Mr. Miyagi play the emperor. And it was also cool seeing the voice actor for Uncle Iroh and Aku in this. So yeah, I really do feel like this was a missed opportunity to represent Asian culture in Hollywood. And with that being said, I still feel that the actors playing these characters did a really good job. And I really don't get the feeling that they were trying to offend anyone. I got the feeling that they were really doing this from the heart. One thing I love most about the episode is the music. The music is wonderful. It's so beautiful, and every time I listen to it, I always feel at peace. You can listen to this as a meditation tape. I almost recommend it. And once again, the sets look amazing. When we're outside, you feel like we're outside. And when we're inside, yeah, there's a lot of light, but it still looks really wonderful. Yeah, it's kind of the quality of what you see in like an on-stage play, but it's still pretty nice for what we got. And apparently the production design was inspired by the work of French artist Edmond Dulac. And it clearly shows. And even the costumes look like a step up from all of their other episodes. At least so far, anyway. The side characters are a lot of fun, too. Barbara Hershey is pretty good as the maid. Bud Cort gets a few laughs as the music master. And every time I watched this episode, I kept thinking, is that a woman? And there's even a cameo from Angelica Houston as a fairy. It is kind of weird and it seems to pop out of nowhere, but, you know, it's fun to see her anyway. And of course, we have to talk about Shelley Duvall. She makes her third appearance in this episode as the narrator and the voice of the Nightingale bird. And she does a great job giving the Nightingale a softness to her. And even though the bird puppet isn't really on the same level as Disney animatronics, it's still a pretty effective animatronic. And one of the most surreal scenes in the episode is when the Emperor is sick in his bed. There's a moment where he seems close to death. All the lights turn out, and there's this demon that comes in through the window, and there's this floating head around him, and there's this whispering in the background. It's a really creepy scene. Like, what the heck is this thing? Is he imagining it? Is this really happening? So, even though the pacing is kind of off, and the whitewashing definitely does leave a bad taste in my mouth, I actually really do like this episode. The music is wonderful, the costumes and the sets are wonderful, and I really love the tragedy of the story. It's one of those stories where you don't really need a lot of talking, you can just watch and listen to what happens. The music actually seems to do the majority of the storytelling, Plus, it's a story that I'm not really familiar with, and apparently it was the first Hans Christian Andersen story that they did on this TV series, while the ones before were Grimm fairy tales. And that was actually an interesting fact. I didn't know that this was a Hans Christian Andersen story. I'm glad I came in not knowing about this story. I'm glad that I had a fresh perspective on it. And I love the book's moral on how much we always try to make things better and shinier, and how it always doesn't. It's kind of funny how it matches our world's view on always wanting better and newer technology. Unfortunately, if people watch this nowadays, they probably would get offended by the whitewashing. And I can perfectly understand that. But if people are willing to give it a chance, I actually would recommend it. Personally, I think it's one of Fairy Tale Theater's best episodes. So if you're interested, check it out. I assure you, you'll enjoy.